in mind. Right? Keep that in mind. It shouldn't all make complete sense yet. I think that it's like a puzzle. You get the more pieces you can put in there, the more it begins to make sense. Um, so what we want to do is use these concepts and kind of get into how these concepts will help us understand what it is we need to understand. So what I want to do today is kind of pick up where we left off before and get us to these early colonies as quickly as possible, but we have to spend some time on some of this background, right? How is it that we're going to get in this position? So last time we talked about the kind of early New World encounters and such. This time we want to get into what specifically is happening in the Old World, particularly in Europe, that's going to propel people this direction, and that's going to give them a certain level of baggage that they will bring with them to the New World, for better or for worse. Right? Some of the stuff we're going to talk about might be positive. Some of it may not be. Right? Some of it might be very negative, violent even. But what I want to do is understand what's happening and actually use these concepts that we're now familiar with to try to unpack some of this history. Be thinking about significance, right? Be thinking about significance here and how we pull out historical significance, especially using these two concepts that we now have at our disposal, I'd imagine, community and tipping point. So these terms are some terms I'm going to work through really quickly here as part of this conversation, but be thinking about how the concepts we just laid out can really, really help us to, I think, unpack this. So in order to understand what eventually is going to become the United States, we got to deal a bit with some events in the Old World. I told you early American history is as much about an Atlantic world history as it is about U.S. history. Right? It's as much about what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic at the same time. Right? That's going to ultimately impact what happens here. So we have to talk a bit about some European events, specifically something called the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation. If you've taken other world history classes or a class on religion, you know this term. What I want to do is sort of explain how it's going to connect specifically to our story. We want to be kind of focused on how we're going to, how this is going to be useful for us in a very specific way. So the Protestant Reformation comes into the conversation pretty quickly. What is this? Well, throughout the Middle Ages, religion has been important, of course, and the church has been important. In this case, specifically in Europe, the Catholic Church was incredibly important, not just as a religious institution, but as a political institution, as an economic institution. What do I mean? Well, throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had been extremely powerful. In fact, the church was Europe's wealthiest landowner and institution. So not just in terms of where people went on Sunday, right? But its wealthiest landowner and institution. One reason that it gets in this position, one reason that it became so powerful, was because of a certain sort of religious or cultural practice, a religious or cultural practice called the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences. Now, this sale of indulgences is eventually going to become problematic for some within the church itself. And this is going to unlock a chain of events that's going to impact us. So we want to unpack this chain of events and see why this is going to be a tipping point in both world history and in U.S. history. So this sale of indulgences. Well, what is this sale of indulgences? What is it? Well, basically, it looked a little something like this. People would donate land and money. People would donate land and money to the church. Well, why would they do that? Well, first of all, they do it because they're religious people. They feel like this is what God would want them to do. But they would donate land and money to the church. In return, they were told that after death, they would spend less time in purgatory before going to heaven. Right? So if they donate land and money, they would spend less time in purgatory before going to heaven. Again, if you're a religious person, this is going to be very motivating for you. If you have it to give, you're going to do that, right? At least most would. They're told that after death, they can get to heaven more quickly, essentially. Now, these and other practices, though, in the minds of some, would cause problems. They might lead to corruption. Because as we know, when people get involved in anything, and money's involved, it often leads towards corruption. People can corrupt anything, unfortunately, it seems. And so some are going to start to have a problem with this practice. Some within the church start to have a problem with this practice. So these and other practices are seen as leading to corruption and perhaps abuse of power. And some will start to criticize the church itself for it. For example, in 1517, a German monk by the name of Martin Luther, I somehow deleted his name off here, I don't know why, but Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but also think about how that figure is going to be questioning authority in a certain way. But Martin Luther in 1517 will begin what's known as the Protestant Reformation. In Europe, he called for an end to the practice of the sale of indulgences and other things he saw as abuses of power. He says, we got to stop this. It's not what God wants, right? Some of you may know the story. He nails the 95 Theses to the door of the church, right? This kind of announces this kind of revolutionary moment, right, within the church. And it's going to have a ripple effect in the society. Now, Martin Luther was German. So immediately in Germany, it causes a split. There are going to be those that defend the church and say, no, this person is questioning authority in a way that's not right. They defend the church. There are others that line up with Martin Luther. So it kind of causes almost a religious civil war in Germany within the church. Now, as we know, this is not going to remain in just one nation. It's going to spread like an epidemic, Gladwell would say. So you can use nationalism or imagined community to understand this. Suddenly you have two imagined communities within the church. Those that argue it needs to be reformed, those that argue that it's fine the way it is. And this will ultimately spread and become an epidemic. So Martin Luther kind of lets the cat out of the bag, I guess we could say, or starts a process that is going to be significant. So soon Germany is divided. Those that support Martin Luther will call themselves Lutherans or Protestants. Lutherans or Protestants. Those that remain loyal to the Catholic Church will remain Catholic. So you have this split between Protestantism and Catholicism developing in Germany. But of course it spreads, right? It spreads to places like France and the Netherlands and other nations. And for our purposes, we want to look specifically at the impact of this spread to England, because England will eventually form these colonies. Right, so we get pretty quickly to how it's going to impact our story. Now, some people in England also agree with Martin Luther. Right? Some also agree with Martin Luther in England. But the king of the time was a guy named King Henry VIII of England. King Henry VIII. And for the most part, England chooses to remain Catholic at this point. Right? The king at the time was King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII initially had no issue with the Pope or with Catholic authority. He's like, he's kind of staying out of it. England is an island, right? You can kind of stay away from some of this stuff. He remains loyal initially to the church in 1517. But King Henry VIII has a problem. His problem is this. In 1527, 10 years later, King Henry VIII wants a divorce. He wants a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He blames Catherine of Aragon for not giving him a male child, a male heir. Now, you bio majors will say it was probably King VIII's issue, and not producing a male child, but he blames Catherine of Aragon. So he says, I want a divorce. He gets a hold of the Pope and says, I want a divorce. And the Pope says, no, you can't have it. Now, this is an issue. King Henry VIII has kind of subjected himself to papal authority, right? The Pope is even a higher authority than a king. And so in asking for this divorce and being declined, he now has an issue. Now, there may be a couple of reasons why the Pope has declined Henry's divorce. Number one, religiously speaking, right? Divorce is kind of seen as a no-no, generally. But in addition, Catherine of Aragon is politically important and well-placed. Catherine of Aragon was a member of the Spanish royal family. The Spanish royal family is probably the biggest supporter of the Pope and the Church at this point. So Catherine could probably make a few phone calls and say, I don't give this guy what he wants, right? She's well-placed. This is an issue. Right? This is an issue. So think about how this may be involved in religious belief and also in politics. Right? This is politically problematic for a number of folks. So what's Henry going to do? Eventually, Henry will decide to question the authority of the Pope himself and decides to break away from the Catholic Church. Right? He's going to break away from the Catholic Church. In 1534, the British Parliament will pass an Act of Supremacy, the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This Act of Supremacy will break them away from the Catholic Church and will establish a new church called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. The Church of England or the Anglican Church. Now, who is going to be the head of the Church of England or the Anglican Church? King Henry VIII is the head of his own new church. So this is 1534. He is the head, the Anglican Church. So some scholars, some historians argue that the Protestant Reformation, although it may be about religion in various places, is more about politics in England, right? More about this political problem that Henry VIII had. More political than religious in this way. Nevertheless, when England breaks away from the Catholic Church, it's going to be a tipping point, right? It's going to open up the door for many to embrace perhaps more radical visions of religion. Perhaps it opens up the door for questioning authority generally. If you're willing to question the Pope's authority, you're willing to question any kind of authority. That's the highest authority, if that's your religious background, right? So once you let the cat out of the bag and start questioning authority, I think it's going to be hard to stop it. This also will be important for our purposes. Think about how these American colonies are eventually going to question the king's authority. So once you start this process, maybe you reach the tipping point. Maybe you never go back to the way things were, as Gladwell would argue. So again, this opens the door. Many will embrace more radical religious views, more radical religion that tend to be taking hold in Europe at the time. One such religious belief was Calvinism. Followers of John Calvin will call themselves Calvinists. And Calvinism is one of these more radical religious visions that's perhaps taking hold throughout Europe. Now, Calvinism stressed, for example, God's power over man, to sort of allegiance to God in this particular way. Now, in England, followers of Calvinism, Calvinists in England, became known as Puritans. Puritans. Now, that should sound familiar in terms of U.S. history. Puritans. Puritans want to purify the Church of England. Puritans in England believe that the Reformation there had not gone far enough in purifying the church of its issues. Right? They're like, yeah, that's great, you broke away from the Catholic Church, but you didn't do enough to kind of put you in a position where you were doing what God wants. So these Puritans will continue to agitate in England to try to purify the church. They specifically felt like the Anglican Church had not gone far enough. That makes sense in terms of what a Puritan is. Now later, some Puritans will leave England and will call themselves Pilgrims. So this is important for our story. They want a more sweeping reformation. They want an even broader revolution, you can argue. And so they continue to question authority. Well, Henry VIII would finally have a son, but the son died after having been king for only about 6 years. He was sickly and does not sort of last in that way. After that, Henry's first daughter, Mary the First, became queen. Mary the First became queen. Well, Mary was Catholic, and Mary decided that she wants to return England back to its traditional Catholicism. Right? Mary decides that this is the direction she wants to take the nation. And she was willing to accomplish this by any means. Right? By any means. So what will this mean? Well, Mary was only in power for about 5 years. I'll put a quick time on here because I think it helps to visualize this a bit. Right? Mary the First is in power from 1553 to 1558. So it's only a 5-year period, but it's going to be a significant 5-year period under Mary because certain things happen that are going to leave a mark. Right? For example, Mary, in trying to restore the Catholic Church in England, will be particularly brutal and violent towards English Protestants. If you did not want to convert, you could be killed. Now, I would say that when you are persecuted for your religious beliefs, if you're persecuted for your cultural beliefs, for your race, for your whatever it is, you're going to remember that, right? Even when that particular event is over, you're not going to forget what has happened to you. So I would argue that as early as the 1550s, these Puritans may start to question whether England is still their imagined community. They may already start to question whether this is still home, whether it's safe. There's going to be a certain insecurity even after Mary is gone. Now, Mary, again, is willing to use violence, and she's going to actually execute many. What do you think Mary's nickname was? Bloody Mary, right? That's where that nickname comes from. Now, although she dies in 1558, it's going to leave a mark. I think it leaves a long historical memory on these English Protestants. They never completely get over this. Even when Mary will be succeeded by Elizabeth the First, some of these Puritans have already decided that maybe they ought to go someplace else. Right? Maybe they should pick up and form an imagined community elsewhere. Now, Massachusetts is not going to be the first place they try. But they will decide to try to set up shop someplace else. And I think that's important to our story. But Elizabeth is also very important, and often I would say she does get a lot of credit, but may not get enough credit in some respects for what she does. Elizabeth will reign for 45 years. Almost half a century, Elizabeth is going to be reigning in England. And under her reign, things begin to calm down. England begins to make progress as a nation. England really had been almost a sort of a second-rate kind of power. Spain and Portugal were much more powerful. Right? Spain in particular had always kind of kept England under its thumb. Elizabeth wants to change all that. She wants to make her nation great. Right? And so she's going to try to find some ways to do this. One of the things that's important that Elizabeth does is she's Protestant. But she, perhaps recognizing what Mary had done before her, decides not to go the same route. She will institute something called the Elizabethan settlement. Elizabethan settlement. So even though Elizabeth was Protestant, she will retain or she will keep many Catholic rituals and sacraments and traditions. She doesn't persecute folks the way that Mary had. Why? Because she wants the nation to prosper. She wants things to calm down. She wants progress in the way that she sees it. So some see this as very important, this kind of Elizabethan settlement. Now, Elizabeth would also start building an English navy. Right? She'll start developing a more modern navy because England essentially did not have one to speak of compared to the Spanish at this point. This is going to be important because eventually England and Spain will have a major naval conflict that's going to have a significant impact on world history, a significant impact on British history, and a significant impact on what becomes the United States. 1587, 1588, an event called the Spanish Armada will happen, which is going to be a major tipping point. I think do something around that, so I'll come back to that point. The Spanish Armada, 1587. 1588 happens under Elizabeth's reign. Ultimately, England in that Armada battle will defeat a much larger Spanish force. This unsinkable, undefeatable Armada sent by the Spanish to destroy and invade England will not do that. Now remember, these two are at odds. This Catholic nation, this Protestant nation, are having national rivalries, you could argue, and it's going to lead to conflict. Ultimately, this conflict is going to impact us here. It's only after 1588 that England is finally able to kind of establish itself in the New World. Now, something else that Elizabeth does is also important for our story. In addition to the Elizabethan settlement, Elizabeth will also kind of follow her father's example in trying to colonize Ireland. She wants to colonize Ireland. Now, how does that make sense? Well, England essentially looked at the Irish as a backward people, looked at them as savages, not practicing religion properly. They're like, well, wait a second. I thought Irish folks were white. I thought English folks were white. The English didn't look at the Irish as being white in the traditional sense. They looked at them as being culturally backward, as not farming properly, as not practicing Christianity properly, and they thought that they should be enslaved. Now, why is this important? Well, think about what's going to happen when the English arrive in the New World and see native peoples. What do they think of them? They think that they're not practicing religion properly. They think that they're not farming properly. They think that they're culturally backward and need to be assimilated, accommodated, acculturated. So I'm going to argue that folks bring culture with them, right? For better or for worse. They bring some positive aspects, perhaps. They may also bring some baggage with them. Now, since 1100, 1200 AD at least, the English and the Irish had conflict, destruction, colonization. So perhaps it's not a surprise the way things are going to eventually go here in the New World. Folks tend to see the world a certain way, and they tend to keep seeing the world that way until sort of forced to change, perhaps. So keep this in mind in terms of some of the later stuff we're going to get into. By about 1600, England is a rival to Spain, right? Slowly, England is going to catch up, and slowly Spain is going to start to decline. It's going to take a while, right? But that does begin to happen, you could say, beginning with the Spanish Armada incident, perhaps. And Elizabeth has a lot to do with it, modernizing England, getting it caught up. Now, that's why I say she gets a lot of credit, but perhaps could get even more credit. Now, perhaps the reason why she doesn't get as much credit is because she dies in 1603. And she will be succeeded by her cousin, James, King James of Scotland. Elizabeth dies without an heir. She dies with no children. This is why Queen Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen. Had no kids. So when she dies, she wanted her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, to also succeed her and become King James I of England. This is what happens. So a lot of what happens in terms of our early colonies happens under James's reign. But you could argue that Elizabeth kind of sets the stage, right? She kind of set the table, and then James could come eat, basically. This is why I think she does deserve a lot of attention in this. So again, it's under James's reign that the first successful English colonies are going to be established in North America. Jamestown, Virginia, is established in 1607. 1607, Jamestown, Virginia, named after who? King James. In which colony? Virginia, named after who? The Virgin Queen, Elizabeth. We tend to bring our culture with us. We tend to name things that are familiar, that are like home, right? I had an apartment in college. I had several apartments in college, 13 to be exact. And every time we moved, we brought that same old raggedy couch with us. For some reason, it didn't feel like home until we got that raggedy couch in a new place, right? But there's something familiar about it. There's something that feels like home in a new place when you bring something with you. And I'm going to argue that even in naming, you're going to see how the English are going to be recreating a certain imagined community here in the New World. They're going to be bringing things with them that were familiar, that were comforting in that sense. Now, again, England had been interested in North America for a long time. They read all the stories about Columbus writing letters back to Spain, right, about how this new world was gold everywhere and gold in the streets and land of milk and honey and all that kind of stuff, right? England wants to get a seat at the table, but they couldn't. Spain would not let them until after the Spanish Armada incident. But England had been long interested in the New World. In fact, in the 1490s, 1497 specifically, King Henry VII had sent an Italian explorer by the name of John Cabot, an Italian explorer, to explore eastern Canada. It's 5 years after Columbus. But before Elizabeth, England is still a relatively poor country, and they didn't have the funds to follow up on these explorations, right? It's going to take a tipping point for them to really get a seat at the table. Yes. 1497, they had sent John Cabot. Now, the main reason I think that's significant is think how early that is, right? Jamestown isn't founded until 1607. Yet the English had a presence here, and interest in there, at least since the 1490s. But it's going to take some things happening before they can capitalize on that. And that's part of what we'll investigate. In 1585, Elizabeth herself had authorized Sir Walter Raleigh, Raleigh, North Carolina. Elizabeth had authorized Sir Walter Raleigh to establish a settlement off the Carolina coast. This settlement would be named Roanoke. Roanoke is in Roanoke, Virginia today. So they named the settlement Roanoke. However, the attempt will fail. The English, disappointed at not finding gold there in 1585, returned to England after a very harsh winter in 1586. They will try a second attempt at Roanoke in 1587. But this is going to be one of those sort of mysteries of history that continues to this day. Turn on the History Channel, there are a lot of good documentaries about the lost colony of Roanoke. What happens is they set up another colony at Roanoke, leave some settlers there. Some go back to England to get supplies and more people. They come back, and when they come back, these settlers have mysteriously disappeared. Some historians and anthropologists and others argue that these settlers probably angered the native peoples, got themselves killed. Others argue that they may have intermarried with native peoples and just essentially disappeared, blended into these new societies, formed new imagined communities. We still don't know for sure. There are still debates about this. All they found when they came back to resupply this colony was one word carved on a tree in a Native American language. It said Croatoan. So it's still one of these kind of mysteries as to what happened to this lost colony. Again, all of this kind of proves the point that England had been interested in this geographical space. They just couldn't really capitalize on it until certain things fall into place. But they had not lost interest in North America. Why are they so interested? Well, one thing, English Protestants saw colonization of the New World as a good way to kind of check the Spanish. Right? So as Protestants, they wanted to kind of check their Catholic rivals. As Englishmen, they wanted to check their Spanish rivals. The nationalism may come into this. What better way to do that? Establish colonies. Establishing colonies was seen as one of the best ways to enrich the mother country. Right? You get these colonies, then you can get all these resources and things for the mother country. We were a colony. We were designed to benefit England. Not to become a great nation ourselves, but to benefit England. Right? So that's important to our story. Now, what other things are in place by this point? When James comes to power in 1603, there are now some things in place. And one of them we mentioned last time. Remember last time we mentioned joint stock companies? Joint stock company. Remember what a joint stock company was? Good. Funding. It's a funding source. These investors pooling their money to finance various voyages. So perhaps if you could find a joint stock company interested in exploring the New World or setting up a settlement, you wouldn't have to find a king or a queen that could pay for your voyage. It will be a joint stock company that sets up Jamestown, Virginia, which is actually very important for the early history of Jamestown, Virginia. So there are joint stock companies, enough investors willing to risk their money to try to make a profit. on their investment. Right? They're willing to underwrite these risky voyages that may not make it back, with the hope that they do make it back and that they make their money back, 10, 20 times over. Right? So this notion of these joint stock companies are really important in a variety of ways. I think about joint stock companies. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, many of these investors are excited by terrific tales of New World wealth, right? Remember Columbus had written back about this, and people like Richard Halkett, promoter, had written back to Europe about how fantastic this land was. So if you had some money, you might feel like this is a good investment, right? When he became king, James I will continue Elizabeth's attempts to establish an English presence in the New World. Right? An English presence in the New World. And the first successful English settlement would be in Virginia, named after Elizabeth, right, the Virgin Queen, and it will be at Jamestown, named after King James, in 1607. So what happens? What does this look like? How does this all sort of go down? Well, in 1607, the London Company, which was a joint stock company, right, the London Company will establish Jamestown, Virginia. They will send 3 ships with 104 or 105 people. 3 ships to establish Jamestown. They would sail into the Chesapeake Bay, sail 50 miles up the James River, named for King James, and they will set up Jamestown, Virginia. Now, there's something already significant about this 104, 105 people. They're all male. No British women are on the ship. Now, that was a bad idea to begin with. How are you going to have a new society with no women? I'm not going to get into that yet. You can imagine that this might be problematic for some involved, that it might cause some issues, right? It might cause some issues. But perhaps it makes sense. If you're the London Company, your goal is to get a profit. Get a return on your investors' money as quickly as possible. Get rich quick. Send the money back. You expect to jump off the ship in Virginia and see all this gold laying around, and maybe some native peoples willing to trade gold for anything, right? That's the stories they'd heard, at least. The English had heard stories about the Spanish getting wealthy in all these mines and such, and so they want a piece of that pie. But their sole purpose was to return a profit to their investors. So this is going to be important for our story as well. Now, what happens, though, in Virginia is that the early years will be a disaster. Right? The early years will be largely a disaster for a few reasons that we probably could have predicted. Number one, these 104 young, single, unattached men without parental authority, perhaps on a trip for the first time. Okay, let me break it down this way in 2019 terms. Let's say my mom calls me up and says, let's go to Vegas for a week, summer vacation. I'm like, okay, that's fine. That sounds like a lot of fun, Mom. Maybe I'll play a few slot machines, right? Well, let's say my college buddy calls me and says, hey, let's go to Vegas for a week. Now, it's the same location, but who you're going with matters. Who you're going with matters. These guys are coming to a new place. They're coming without parental authority. They're coming without the traditional authority that would have been in place in England. And they feel like nobody can tell them what to do. Some will argue that they're immediately undisciplined. They hop off the ship and they start taking off. I'm going to go find gold. I'll be back around dark. I'll have a basket full of gold, and then let's go back. Now let's go home. Now, some on the ship are like, wait, let's stay here. Let's plant some corn and let's build some stable housing. I'm like, forget that. I'm not going to be here long enough for all that. I didn't come here to be a farmer. So this idea of discipline is going to be very important and very difficult to manage in early Virginia. They believe, perhaps naively, they're going to find gold. Why do you need to plant corn when you're going to find all this gold? But as we know, when they don't find it, what happens when winter comes? You don't have any food. You don't have a good place to live. It's going to be problematic. It's going to be problematic in early Jamestown. Early Jamestown will be a death trap. Many died of malnutrition. Many died of disease. Virginia is a swampy area, so malaria was an issue for these new arrivals. Many are killed in conflicts with the local native group, which is the Powhatan Confederacy, which may have been more than 10,000 strong at least at this point. And so this is an issue. Discipline itself is a major problem. These Jamestown settlers, young unattached males, prefer to go off looking for gold rather than guarding the settlement, planting crops, doing all these sorts of things you have to do for a permanent, stable settlement. Some argue that maybe the colony would not have survived had it not been for John Smith. Captain John Smith will institute a form of military discipline. John Smith does a couple of important things. He's like, you know what? We need to institute some discipline here. If you look at some of the earliest laws of Virginia, they're going to be very harsh. You could get the death penalty for dozens of crimes, including blasphemy. They try to rein folks in quickly. Captain John Smith makes a rule that every male has to work for the colony. Now, this is actually revolutionary because elite males are like, I'm not a farmer. That's what poor people do. I have serfs that do that back home. I'm not going to be working in the dirt. Captain John Smith says, yes, you are. Because if you don't, we're not going to survive. Right? So this idea of all people working equally, right, at least the idea of that is going to be very important to be instituted here. Right? In addition, Captain John Smith will trade for food with the local native population and kind of get some good arrangements with the native peoples who help them live. Right? So he institutes a couple of things. Regardless of your social status, your social class, your social privilege, you have to work. And he also will trade with the native population. Now, eventually, John Smith has a gunpowder accident. He has to go back to England. But he does put some things in place that help the colony survive, which is going to be very important because they are dying, right? Life expectancy in early Virginia might be 30 years old. Right? 30 years old. It's a death trap early on. What's the London Company going to do? Because if all these folks die, they lose their money. They lose their investment. So what do? Send more people. Send more settlers. In the fall of 1609, the London Company will send over 500 more settlers. 500 more settlers will be shipped to Jamestown in 1609. What they find when they get there is horrible. 1609 to 1610, and these years are known as the starving time. The starving time. People are literally starving. So they hop off the ship and they are scared at what they find in Jamestown. Most of the folks are dead. Other folks are literally struggling, starving. People are writing letters back home to England about killing and eating rats because they don't have any food. When they jump off the ship, a guy is on trial for killing his pregnant wife and trying to eat her. This is how bad it was. Literally the starving time. This wasn't a figure of speech. And even these new arrivals are going to struggle quite a bit. For example, take this 1609 to 1610 as being like a school year, like fall to spring. In fall of 1609, the London Company sends 500 settlers. How many of those 500 do you think were still alive come spring? Very close. 60 of the 500 are alive. The rest are already dead in 1 year. This is how bad it was. It does not look like this place is going to make it. Right? It does not look like it's going to make it. Even with this harsh military discipline, right? 60 of the 500 see the following spring. John Smith, of course, has been forced to leave because of the gunpowder accident. How are they going to get folks to come? Now, if you're in London and you heard all these stories, right, about gold, you're like, man, I'm packing my bags. I heard that this Virginia place is fantastic. Then all of a sudden you get a tweet, text message, Insta, whatever, from your cousin in Virginia telling you, you know what? Don't come here. It's horrible. People are eating each other. This place is horrible. Don't believe the advertisements. It's going to be difficult to get you on that ship. Right? It's going to be difficult to get you on that ship, but the London Company needs people to come if this colony is going to survive and flourish. How will they get people to come? How will they get people? What kind of incentive do you think they can come up with to get people to risk it all, to roll the dice, to come to this new world? Huh? Land. Land is going to be a tremendous incentive, especially if you're a farmer. You're an agricultural-based society. Imagine you live in London and you have no land. You're a farmer with no land. Now, a farmer with no land is doubly oppressed because not only do you have a place to live, you don't have a job, right? The farm for a farmer is both their home and their work. So if you're milling about the streets of London, right, begging, you might be willing to roll the dice. Man, just get me on that ship. I can work hard, right? Some will say this is maybe the early American dream right here. Right? Hard work pays off. Just give me a chance. Give me an opportunity. Just get me to this new place. I'll show you. I'll beat the odds. It's the whole immigration story. I'm willing to go through all kinds of things to come here and work hard to make my American dream. I can change my life in one lifetime. Remember, these early Americans are going to pride themselves on class instead of caste. You don't have to be born into royalty. Right? You can work your way into the middle class. Right? It's very much a part of the American dream. So a lot of folks are going to be willing to roll the dice. And the London company is going to use this idea of this available free open land to get people to come. But they're actually going to do two things. Land is going to be an incentive for two different groups. One group that they want to come are the desperate, those that don't have anything to lose. But they also want some middle class folks to come. How are you going to get somebody that's doing okay in England to want to get on a ship, risk death to arrive in this new place? And the answer is the same: land. They're going to institute something called the head right system. The head right system. Let me skip ahead a little bit in terms of this timeline. In 1616, the London Company will institute something called the head right system. Now, what is the head right system? Specifically is this: if you had enough money to pay your passage on the ship, if you were in London and you had enough money in your pocket to buy a ticket, you could take advantage of the head right system, which basically said you would get 50 acres of land for every ticket you bought, every head you paid for. Right? So if you had enough money for the ticket, get on the ship, land in the New World, you get 50 acres of land. Plus an extra 50 acres of land for every head you paid for. So imagine you're a upper middle class family of four, husband, wife, 2 kids, let's say, and you have enough money for the ticket. You math majors in the room, help me out. How many acres of land would they get when they arrived in the New World, this family of four? 4. 200 acres. Now, to give you some scope, Mount Sac, all of it, 420 acres. This is a good amount of land. If you got a little bit of money, you got some seed, you can turn that into something, right? This might be like a lottery ticket. So this is going to work as well. This head right system will actually be a good incentive for bringing middle class folks to come. Now, the majority of folks do not have the money for the ticket, so they cannot take advantage of this head right system. They're going to actually take advantage of something else. Something else, as we'll see here in a second. But first, I wanted to introduce that notion of the head right system. Now, some say this also causes a problem because a number of wealthy folks will take advantage of this. Oh, yeah, I'm going to send over 10 workers, right? I'm going to sponsor 10 people to come. So they get all these acres, and they got people to work these acres when they arrive. So you might get already a class system developing, right? A small group of folks that have all the good land, and then a bunch of folks that are like, where's our land? Now, the other side of this story, though, is, as I said, the majority of folks do not have enough money for the ticket. In fact, 75% of British settlers will not have the money for the ticket. And they're going to come here through another plan that we'll talk about, indentured servitude. Indentured servitude. We'll go back to that in a second, though. So besides the establishment of martial law, right, the creation of land ownership incentives, a couple of other things start to work in the colony's favor. Right? A couple of other things start to work in the colony's favor. One of them is going to be this colonist by the name of John Rolfe. John Rolfe. Right around 1614 or so, John Rolfe is going to do 2 important things for the colony of Virginia. He's known for 2 important things. John Rolfe, this prominent colonist, will marry. Now, wait a second. I said that there were no women yet, right? So who's he going to marry? Well, John Rolfe decides to marry a Native American woman by the name of Matawaka. Matawaka is better known to us as Pocahontas. Pocahontas, or Matawaka, was the daughter of the local Powhatan chief. So in this marriage, what he accomplishes is not only finding himself a wife, but actually kind of forming a political alliance with the local Powhatan Confederacy. So this starving time kind of becomes what they call a breathing time, right? It calms things down. They can get food, they can get assistance. There's less conflict and warfare, right? From about 1614 till about 1618, in part because of this marriage. Now, I know in some Disney movies, it's John Smith that marries, sometimes we combine these two characters, John Rolfe and John Smith. They're two different figures. John Rolfe is the one that marries Mataoaka. Now, what happens with Mataoaka? Now, think about how the natives are viewed. Mataoaka, better known to us as Pocahontas, would actually be renamed Rebecca. She would be brought back to Europe, converted to Christianity, and she kind of goes on tour throughout England as almost like advertisement for the New World. Right? So there are these pictures of like Mataoaka or Rebecca wearing like traditional English clothing. Right? She becomes like this advertisement for colonization. Now, unfortunately, she dies in 1617, only 3 years later. But some see this as an example of how the British already see native peoples, right, as somebody that needs to be converted, somebody that needs to be assimilated in certain ways, and how that's going to be problematic culturally, how that may lead to conflict, right? You can decide what you want, think what you want about that example. But this is one of the important things that John Rolfe does. The other important thing that John Rolfe does is John Rolfe is credited with domesticating a form of tobacco that will grow in Virginia. Domesticating a form of tobacco that will grow in Virginia. Remember, Virginia has been looking for its gold. They've been looking for this cash crop. They've been looking for a way to make money, return their investors' profits. They don't find gold. But they find green gold after John Rolfe is able to do what he does. He actually gets some seeds from Spanish possession, even though it was illegal. The Spanish did not want the British getting this, right? Now, the British had known about tobacco for quite some time. They known about it since Columbus's voyages to the Caribbean, especially. King James looked at tobacco as a dirty practice, as a sin. I think King James Bible. Right? And initially, King James had banned the smoking of tobacco. But as we know, certain practices that may have once been illegal involving green plants may slowly over time become more legal, especially when the idea of taxing them and raising tremendous revenues for this. Okay, you don't know what I'm talking about. So somebody probably got in King James' ear like, hey, it can make the nation a lot of money if we legalize it and tax it. Right? Legalize it and tax it. We got this crop that's working. The colony can survive and flourish, and this is what will happen, right? This is what will happen. The first cargo of Virginian-produced tobacco, grown tobacco, will be sold in England by 1617. It's going to increase. Huh? It was. Now, they had a lot of, I think they had a leg up because the Spanish had really already found some that grow in the New World. And that's why they didn't want to share that, right? He smuggles those seeds out somehow into these territories. But this is going to be really important for Virginia. It's going to be really important. Now, almost immediately, Jamestown settlers will dive with both feet into production of tobacco. Right? Now, so, okay, story's over, right? Happy ending. Everything's great, right? You got rich, you got the lottery ticket. Now, this will make tremendous money for the colony. It's going to allow the colony to begin to flourish and pay for itself. But tobacco has at least three problems. At least three problems that are going to immediately emerge and that are going to impact the history of this colony. So we want to unpack this, right? This is a good example of pulling out the significance of some of this, and tobacco in particular, pulling out the significance of this. Well, what are these three problems? Well, first of all, Virginians will put all their eggs in one basket. You econ majors, they fail to diversify their portfolio. They don't want to grow anything else but tobacco. So let's say this is our Jamestown right here, right? We're all settlers, and we're like, yeah, okay, we have this tobacco crop. Let's plant tobacco. As much as we can, let's make some money. Finally, we have something. Let's make some money. Now, some of you econ majors in the room that are wiser than me would probably say, you know what? Let's plant this half of the room tobacco, but on this half, let's plant corn. We have some food. We got a diverse portfolio. And what do I say at this point? No. Let's plant all tobacco. Then we'll just sell a little bit of it and we'll buy corn. Maybe we can buy popcorn. I don't know. Now, why is that dangerous? Well, when you're making money, it's fine. But what happens when that first crop doesn't come in? Not only do you not have tobacco to sell, but you don't have any food. So failing to diversify, some argue this actually begins a process in the Deep South of relying on one cash crop. Right? First tobacco, then later cotton. In the good times, it's great. Everybody's making money. But in the lean years, if you don't get enough rain that year, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. So that's problem number one. They fail to diversify. They fail to diversify and will rely on one crop. Second problem with tobacco, soil exhaustion. Soil exhaustion. Now, you all know about exhaustion. You're tired right now. What does soil exhaustion mean? Soil exhaustion is basically this. Let's say this is our colony, Virginia, and we plant tobacco in this colony. We're like, you know what? I think we can make $500 this year. I think in this little plot, we plant every square, we can make $500. That harvest comes, we make $1,000. We're like, yes. What are we going to do? Spend that money, and we're going to be like, you know what? Next year, based on all we learned this year, I think we can make $5,000. What do you think? Are you with me? 5,000? I want to buy a Tesla. So can we do this? 5,000. Let's go. So we harvest it in. And we do it. $5,000. Oh my goodness! All these lean years. Now we got 5,000. You know what? Year 3, I bet you we can make 10. I bet you we can do it based on all we learned these first 2 years. We're gonna make $10,000. You're not with me? Okay, I'll take your land. I'll plant tobacco there too. I'm getting my Tesla this year. Planted that 3rd year, $10,000. Oh my goodness, this is fantastic. Year 4, I'm gonna do it again. I think I can make 25K. Y'all with me? You're like, oh, let's try it. Let's go. You plant stuff in year 4, nothing grows. We're like, uh-oh. What's happened? We've worn out the soil. 3 years consecutive crops in the same year pulls the nutrients out of the soil. We don't know enough yet about fertilizers and regenerating the soil and all these things, although natives would teach them about burying fish, for example, in the soil to help it regenerate. They don't know enough yet to do this, and it wears out the soil. Well, so what? So what? What's going to happen? What are we going to do that 4th year when we don't get any successful crop? What would we do? This is our colony of Jamestown. We're in 1821. What do you think we're going to do? Go somewhere else. Where else are we going to go, though? There are 10,000 Powhatan around us, right? But you're right. We are going to go someplace else. So let's go next door. Let's go to 1831. Hey, I noticed you're not using your land. You're not planting tobacco. We're going to come over here and plant this year because our soil's kind of messed up. I don't know if you heard. It was in the newspaper, right? Our soil's kind of messed up. We're going to plant tobacco, and they slammed the door in our face. Boom. Look, we gave y'all that land. You messed it up already in 3 years? We've been here thousands of years. We didn't mess it up. How you mess it up? Get out of here. We're like, no, you don't understand. We're going to starve. Conflict. Tension. Because the soil is worn out, we have to expand. We're expanding at the expense of native peoples. They're all around us. It's going to lead to increased conflict. So over the years, the conflict will start to increase between British settlements and native peoples. So this tobacco may be a blessing and a curse, especially when we perhaps are a bit reckless with it early on. Right? That's problem number 2, soil exhaustion. Problem number 3, tobacco is labor intensive. Labor intensive. What does that mean? Something is labor intensive. What do you think that means?
It requires a lot of work.
It takes a lot of work. I don't like History 1 in the summertime. It's a lot of work. We didn't come here for all that, right? We want to get rich quick. Well, we got to get somebody else to work for us. Maybe we can look for some other examples of acquiring labor. Remember, Columbus is like, well, let's just enslave the people that we find. Let's enslave the native peoples. They're already here. Why might that be problematic? It might be problematic for several reasons. One, you're outnumbered initially by the natives. What happens if I enslave you and you escape? You go get your cousins and come back and say, hey, I'm about to pop the trunk on you. It's a problem. Put out the call, woo-hoo, and all these people. Oh, forget it, right? That's a problem. Number two, disease. Old world diseases will come in and start to wipe out native peoples. Unfortunately, these old world diseases cause havoc in new world populations. Some native populations will be 90% destroyed before British settlers arrive. You might have one French trader come in with a cough, and it wipes out people. And those that are left are sick, sickly, weak. How are you going to force somebody to work for you if they can't hardly stand? Right? Folks can run away. This is your home turf. You can run away. You know the territory. You can run away and blend in. Go to the mountains and find your people. Right? So these are some of the reasons why enslaving natives won't work long term for the British. Now, eventually, we know that tobacco will become something produced by slaves, African slaves. But that's not the next one tried. That's not the next population tried. Who's tried next? The British themselves. Indentured servants. Indentured servants. Anybody heard that term before? An indentured servant? Indentured servants would sign a contract and basically would sign over their labor for a period, usually 4 to 7 years. Let's say 7 years on average. If you were poor in England and could not afford that trip to take advantage of the headright system, but you still wanted to come to the New World, you could sign an indenture contract. I will work for the London Company, or I'll work for some landowner for 7 years. When I'm done with my 7 years, I will be given freedom dues, as they were called, things that are due to me upon my freedom. After I work my time, I will get freedom dues. What were freedom dues? It might be a piece of land, a small cabin, a mule, some tools, some tobacco seeds. So if you had nothing in England, you might roll the dice, say, man, if I can just get there and work for a few years, I know me, I'll make it, I'll survive, and then I'll have my own farm. I don't have that in England. That might be incentive for people to come. 75 to 80% of British settlers come as indentured servants, come as unfree labor. Now, why is this important? Well, think about this idea of freedom. The majority of them are coming as unfree labor, with the idea that they'll eventually be free. But notions of freedom and being free or unfree are different than they are now. These indentured servants eventually will transition into slaves as the major labor force, and we'll see that process next time. But tobacco plays heavily into this. Perhaps Virginia develops differently without that. So that's the third problem with tobacco. It's labor intensive. Tobacco requires attention at least 9 months out of the year. Right? It's 14 to 16 hour days perhaps. There's not enough labor to produce it, especially as the demand for tobacco increases. Tobacco's a drug. So when they really start wanting it in England, you got to produce more here. That means you need more labor, you need more land. All of this is going to speed up this difficult process. And perhaps some of these consequences are unintended. For example, in early Virginia, males outnumber females 6 to 1. Right? British men outnumber British women 6 to 1 because the idea was these men are stronger, more able-bodied tobacco pickers. Well, how does that make for a stable society when there's 6 men for every 1 woman? Right, we're going to look at this next time. That may cause some other issues. That we'll see tomorrow. Some argue that it leads to social instability. It leads to lawlessness. You have all these young, kind of unattached men that are running around this particular society and doing things that are problematic. Well, why don't they just send over some women? Somebody eventually figures that out. Somebody in England's like, you know what? If we're going to send over all these men, maybe we should also send over some British women if we expect to set up a stable British society. So in 1619, 3 key events happen. 3 key events happen in 1619. Number 1, in 1619, the first British women are sent to Jamestown. The first British women. Now that's 12 years after the founding of the colony. So for 12 years there had been no British women. And they're going to start sending them over to be the wives of planters in 1619. That's event number 1. Event number 2, that's going to be significant. The House of Burgesses will be founded. The House of Burgesses is founded in Virginia. What is a House of Burgesses? It's the first local governing body. Think about like a city council. You start making your own rules, making your own laws and such. Now you can argue this is a good thing. Imagine there's a pothole out on Temple Avenue that's destroying people's tires on the way to school today. But imagine we have to write a letter to the Capitol, say, please fill this pothole, mail it to D.C., right? Wait for it to get read, and wait for somebody to come fix this pothole. That could be months. Now imagine you're in Jamestown. You got to write a letter, mail it 3 months across the Atlantic to the king, wait for him to read it, or her to read it, send 3 months back. Could be a year before you get what you need. So this House of Burgesses starts to make certain decisions locally, right? We start kind of working like an own imagined community. But wait a second, that we're a colony of England. We're supposed to be under the monarch. But we're already starting to make certain decisions for ourselves as early as 1619. Some historians argue that maybe this is the first step towards the American Revolution. Because when you start making your own decisions, eventually you're like, why do I need a king anyway? It's going to take 150 years to get to that point. But some say that maybe this is the first step, this House of Burgesses. But that's the second thing that happens in 1619 in Virginia. The third event that happens in 1619 is also very significant. The first 20 Africans are dropped off in Jamestown in 1619. First 20 Africans are dropped off in 1619. Were not Africans there before. Basically, the story happens like this. There was a Spanish ship, and the Spanish were essentially in control of the slave trade at this point. Right? The Spanish and the Dutch, nationalism, the Spanish and the Dutch do not get along. A Dutch ship would attack the Spanish ship and would rob it of its cargo, steal its cargo, including its African intended for slavery. The Dutch ship is sailing back home and they encounter storms. They do not have enough supplies to get back home. So the Dutch ship says, hey, let's stop at Jamestown. Let's make a deal. We'll trade 20 Africans for food and water so we can get home. So this is how those first 20 Africans got dropped off in Jamestown, Virginia. This is how they get dropped off. Now we know that these 20 will eventually become 4.5 million by the time the Civil War comes. 4 million of them will be slaves. But we have to see how that process happens. What causes this to tip? Right, what causes this to tip? But as you see, that year, 1619 was really important. Right, really important. You see, tobacco itself is a significant factor. Right? We'll talk more about this next time, since you guys have once again sat the whole time with me. This is going to be the setup of colonial Virginia. We'll talk about how its founding itself is very significant and how this plays out and how it's going to become a model for the rest of the colonies as well. All right?